For more than 60 years, one man ruled over the most powerful civilization on earth. His enemies feared him. His people worshipped him. His face was carved into stone on a scale the world had never seen. From the cliffs of Abu Simbel to the colossal temples rising beside the Nile, his image towered above ordinary men like a living god cast into rock. Travelers approaching Egypt saw his statues long before they saw its cities. A warning, a declaration of power. Even today, more than 3,000 years later, his monuments still rise from the sands like the remains of a lost age of gods, weathered by desert winds, blackened by time, yet still standing, as though the ancient world itself refused to forget his name. This is the story of Ramses II, the man history would remember as Ramses the Great. The world he inherited was already ancient. By the time Ramses was born around 1303 BC, the pyramids of Giza were already more than 1,000 years old. To the people of his time, those pyramids were already relics of a distant golden age, ancient even to the ancients themselves. Egypt had survived invasions, civil wars, dynasties that rose and vanished into dust. For nearly 2,000 years, pharaohs had ruled beside the Nile. Kingdoms collapsed around them. But Egypt endured, protected by deserts, fed by the river, and bound together by religion, tradition, and absolute royal power. But now, a new empire was emerging. An empire richer, stronger, and more ambitious than ever before. The pharaohs of the new kingdom had transformed Egypt into a military superpower. Their armies marched far beyond the Nile Valley, into Canaan, Lebanon, and deep into Syria. Foreign rulers sent tribute. Exotic goods poured into Egyptian cities. Cedar wood from distant forests. Silver from Anatolia. The Nile River transformed Egypt into a kingdom unlike any other. Every year, its floods covered the land with fertile black soil. The river was more than water. It was life itself. Without it, Egypt would have been swallowed by desert. Farmers watched the floodwaters with desperate anticipation each year, because the strength of the harvest determined the strength of the kingdom. Harvests fed millions. Gold flowed from Nubia in the south. The mines of Nubia helped finance armies, monuments, temples. Inside those temples, priests guarded enormous treasures. Storehouses filled with grain, wine, oils, statues, perfumes, and offerings from across the empire. Religion shaped every part of Egyptian life. The gods were believed to control the floods, the harvests, the rising of the sun, and the fate of every human soul. And in the middle of it stood the pharaoh, believed not merely to rule Egypt, but to maintain the balance of the universe itself. The Egyptians called this sacred balance Ma'at, order against chaos, life against destruction, and the pharaoh was expected to preserve it at all costs. To his people, he was not simply a king. He was the living link between humanity and the gods. Ramses was born into this world of divine kingship. His father, Seti I, was already a powerful pharaoh and military leader. Seti I had spent years restoring Egyptian authority in territories that had rebelled or fallen under foreign influence. His armies fought campaigns in Syria and Canaan. And through those victories, Egypt tightened its grip on vital trade routes linking Africa and Asia. From childhood, Ramses was raised for war, politics, and power. Royal children lived surrounded by servants, tutors, scribes, priests, and military officers. Every moment of Ramses' life was preparation, because one day, the empire would rest on his shoulders. He trained with soldiers. Endless drills beneath the Egyptian sun. Archery, hunting, combat exercises, lessons in command. Because Egyptian kings were expected to lead armies personally into battle. Studied diplomacy. Messengers and ambassadors constantly moved through the royal court carrying treaties, gifts, warnings, and demands. The ancient world was becoming increasingly connected and increasingly dangerous. Observed priests performing sacred rituals deep within temple halls lit only by torch fire. Massive columns disappeared into darkness overhead. Walls covered in carvings showing gods, pharaohs, victories, and sacred ceremonies. Only priests and royalty could enter the deepest chambers of these temples, places believed to house the divine presence itself. By his teenage years, he was already accompanying military campaigns, watching firsthand how Egypt projected fear across the ancient world. Foreign cities often surrendered before battle even began, because Egypt's armies had earned a terrifying reputation. Disciplined infantry, elite chariot divisions, veteran commanders hardened by years of warfare, preparing for the day he would inherit one of the greatest empires on earth. But beyond Egypt's expanding influence, another superpower was rising: the Hittite Empire, a vast kingdom centered in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Hittites controlled critical trade routes and powerful fortified cities. And as Egypt pushed northward into Syria, collision between the two empires became almost inevitable. And when that moment finally came, Egypt gained not merely a ruler, but a man obsessed with immortality. Unlike many kings before him, Ramses understood the power of image and memory. He ordered statues of himself erected across the empire on a colossal scale, temples covered in scenes of his victories, his name carved endlessly into stone. A king determined to ensure that his name would never die. And for thousands of years, it didn't. Because even after empires collapsed, after temples were buried beneath sand, after entire dynasties vanished from history, the name of Ramses still survived. But before Ramses could become a legend, he would first have to prove himself on the battlefield. Because beyond Egypt's borders, new powers were rising. The struggle for Syria and Canaan was becoming a fight over wealth, influence, and survival itself. Control those lands, and empires grew rich. Lose them, and rivals gained the advantage. And soon, the ancient world would march toward one of the greatest clashes in human history. Under Ramses II, Egypt entered an age of extraordinary wealth and power. Temples rose across the Nile Valley on a scale few civilizations had ever attempted. Entire cities expanded around royal building projects. Stone quarries thundered with activity. Thousands of laborers, craftsmen, scribes, and architects worked to transform the ambitions of the pharaoh into monuments meant to outlive time itself. This was not merely a kingdom. It was an empire. For generations, Egyptian armies had pushed beyond the natural borders of the Nile. Now those conquests brought enormous wealth back into the heart of the kingdom. Foreign rulers paid tribute. Trade flowed constantly through Egyptian ports, roads, and fortresses. From the fertile Nile Delta in the north to the deserts of Nubia in the south, Egypt controlled trade, resources, and military routes that connected entire civilizations. The empire stretched into lands filled with strategic cities, fertile farmland, and vital caravan routes. Control over these territories meant control over commerce itself. And commerce meant power. Gold mines in Nubia filled royal treasuries. Egypt's access to Nubian gold became one of the foundations of its dominance. The precious metal financed armies, massive construction projects, religious ceremonies, and diplomatic gifts sent to foreign kings. Merchant ships crossed the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Their hulls carried grain, papyrus, linen, and luxury goods to distant ports. Egyptian influence reached far beyond the Nile. Caravans carried ivory, incense, copper, cedar wood, exotic animals, and precious stones across the ancient world. Messengers and diplomats moved between royal courts carrying treaties, gifts, and carefully negotiated alliances. Because the ancient world was no longer isolated kingdoms separated by distance. It had become a network of rival powers, watching each other constantly. And at the center of this global network stood Egypt, radiating wealth like the sun itself. Foreign visitors entering Egyptian cities encountered colossal statues, towering obelisks, and temples covered in brightly painted reliefs celebrating the victories of the pharaoh. The scale alone was overwhelming. Everything was designed to project permanence, divine authority, absolute power. The Nile made everything possible. Without the river, there would have been no empire, no cities, no monuments, no Egypt. Its predictable floods transformed desert into farmland. Each year, as the waters rose and spread across the floodplains, they left behind rich black soil capable of sustaining millions of people. The rhythm of Egyptian civilization depended entirely on this cycle. Farmers produced enormous harvests of wheat and barley. Granaries overflowed. The state carefully stored grain against years of poor flooding or famine. Food became power, and Egypt possessed it in abundance. The population grew. Cities expanded. Royal capitals such as Ramses in the eastern delta became centers of administration, military planning, and royal ceremony. Workshops produced weapons, jewelry, chariots, and luxury goods for both the court and the army. Temples became centers of both religion and economic power. The great temples did not function only as places of worship. They controlled land, employed thousands of workers, managed storehouses, and accumulated enormous wealth. Priests held tremendous influence within Egyptian society, and the gods were believed to guide every aspect of life. To the Egyptian people, order and prosperity were gifts from the gods. The concept of divine balance shaped the entire civilization. The Egyptians believed chaos was always waiting beyond the borders of order, beyond the deserts, beyond the frontier, beyond the reach of the pharaoh. And the pharaoh was the living bridge between heaven and earth, not merely chosen by the gods, but viewed as a divine ruler himself, the protector of cosmic order, the guardian of Egypt's survival. Ramses understood this deeply. Few rulers in history mastered royal image and symbolism as effectively as he did. He surrounded himself with symbols of divine authority. Statues portrayed him beside the gods as an equal. Temple walls showed him towering over enemies in battle. His name was carved endlessly into monuments across the empire. Ceremonies reinforced his image as protector of Egypt. Public rituals displayed royal power before massive crowds. Music echoed through temple courtyards. Priests carried sacred statues during religious processions. Incense drifted through the air beneath enormous stone columns painted in vivid colors. Massive festivals celebrated both the gods and the king himself. These celebrations reinforced loyalty throughout the kingdom. Because in Egypt, religion and political power were inseparable. Among the most famous was the Sed festival, a ritual designed to renew the strength and legitimacy of the pharaoh. Traditionally celebrated after decades of rule, the ceremony symbolized the king's continued right to govern Egypt. But Egypt's golden age was not built on wealth alone. It was protected by military power. The empire required constant defense. Rebellions could erupt in distant territories. Trade routes had to remain secure. And rival empires waited for signs of weakness. Fortresses guarded borders. Massive defensive strongholds rose along strategic routes and frontier regions. The Egyptian chariot corps became one of the most feared military forces of the Late Bronze Age. Fast-moving, highly trained, armed with composite bows capable of devastating enemy formations before close combat even began. Bronze weapons flashed beneath the desert sun. Diplomats maintained alliances across the Near East. Letters between kings discussed trade, marriages, military threats, and shifting loyalties. Behind every alliance stood suspicion. Behind every treaty, the possibility of war. Every monument, every temple, every festival, projected a single message to the world. Egypt was unstoppable. Yet beneath this golden surface, a dangerous rivalry was growing. Far beyond the borders of the Nile, another empire sought control over the ancient world. The Hittite Empire had expanded across Anatolia and Syria with alarming speed. Its kings commanded powerful armies and heavily fortified cities. And both empires wanted control over the same territories, especially the rich and strategic lands of Syria. The closer they expanded toward one another, the more inevitable conflict became. And soon, Ramses II would ride north toward destiny. To rule the ancient world, a king needed more than wealth. He needed fear. And Ramses II intended to make Egypt feared across every border. The New Kingdom period had transformed Egypt into a military superpower. Its armies were disciplined, mobile, and deadly. At the heart of this force stood the Egyptian war chariot. Fast, maneuverable, and terrifying in battle. Crews armed with powerful composite bows could strike enemies at high speed across open terrain. Ramses embraced the image of the warrior king completely. Temple carvings portrayed him charging alone into enemy lines, crushing entire armies beneath his chariot wheels. These scenes were political theater, but they reflected a real truth. Ramses personally led campaigns across Syria, Canaan, and Nubia. He worked to secure trade routes, suppress rebellions, and maintain Egyptian dominance. To the south, Egypt tightened control over Nubia and its immense gold resources. To the east, powerful enemies threatened Egyptian influence in the Levant. Among them stood one of the greatest rivals Egypt would ever face, the Hittite Empire. The Hittites controlled large territories in Anatolia and northern Syria. Like Egypt, they possessed advanced armies, skilled diplomacy, and enormous ambition. The two superpowers were now moving toward collision. At stake was control over trade routes, strategic cities, and dominance over the ancient Near East. And at the center of this conflict stood a city called Kadesh, a fortress positioned beside the Orontes River. Whoever controlled Kadesh controlled the gateway between empires. In the 5th year of Ramses' reign, the young pharaoh marched north with tens of thousands of soldiers. Ahead of him waited one of the greatest battles of the ancient world, and one of the most controversial victories in history. The Battle of Kadesh would become one of the most famous confrontations of the ancient world, and maybe one of history's greatest examples of propaganda. Ramses marched north believing victory was near. But the Hittites had prepared a trap. Hittite spies deliberately fed false information to the Egyptians, convincing Ramses that the enemy army was still far away. In reality, thousands of Hittite troops were hidden nearby. As Egyptian divisions became separated, the Hittites struck. War chariots thundered across the battlefield. Chaos erupted. The Egyptian camp was overwhelmed. For a moment, disaster seemed inevitable. Ancient inscriptions later claimed Ramses stood alone against overwhelming odds, that he personally rallied his troops and turned defeat into victory through courage and divine favor. Modern historians remain cautious about these claims. The battle was likely far more complicated. Neither side achieved a decisive victory, but Ramses transformed the event into a masterpiece of royal image-making. Across Egypt, massive temple walls depicted him as an unstoppable warrior blessed by the gods. The story of Kadesh spread across the empire, and while the military outcome remained uncertain, Ramses won something equally important: control over the narrative. Yet, after years of conflict, both Egypt and the Hittites recognized a dangerous truth. Neither empire could fully destroy the other. Eventually, they negotiated peace. The result became one of the earliest known international peace treaties in human history. A remarkable moment in diplomacy. Two ancient superpowers choosing negotiation over endless war. And while the battles eventually faded into history, Ramses ensured that his own version of events would be carved into stone forever. If war brought Ramses glory, construction brought him immortality. No pharaoh in Egyptian history built on the scale of Ramses II. Across Egypt, his monuments rose like declarations of eternal power. Gigantic statues, colossal temples, massive columns carved with hieroglyphs celebrating his reign. To ancient visitors, these structures must have seemed almost impossible. Among his greatest achievements stood Abu Simbel, carved directly into the cliffs of southern Egypt. Four colossal seated statues of Ramses guarded its entrance, each towering over the desert landscape. Inside, the temple aligned with the sun itself. Twice each year, sunlight penetrated deep into the sanctuary to illuminate sacred statues. A stunning fusion of architecture, astronomy, religion, and royal propaganda. But Abu Simbel was only one piece of Ramses' vision. He expanded Karnak, built the Ramesseum, raised obelisks and monuments across the empire. His name appeared everywhere. Some historians believe Ramses intentionally placed his image across Egypt on an unprecedented scale to reinforce divine authority and secure his memory for eternity. And it worked. Thousands of years later, his face still dominates the ruins of Egypt. But these monuments came at enormous cost. Tens of thousands of laborers, artisans, engineers, and craftsmen contributed to these projects. Contrary to old myths, the great monuments of Egypt were not built by massive armies of enslaved people alone. Archaeological evidence suggests many workers were skilled laborers supported by organized state systems. Entire communities formed around construction sites. For Ramses, every stone carried a message. Egypt was eternal, and so was he. Ramses II did not merely rule Egypt. He transformed himself into a living legend. Throughout the empire, his statues towered over temples, cities, and sacred spaces. His image was eternal youth, perfect strength, divine authority. Even as he aged into his later decades, his monuments continued portraying him as powerful and invincible. This was more than vanity. It was political genius. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was believed to maintain cosmic order. To appear weak was dangerous. Power had to feel eternal. And Ramses mastered that illusion. He ruled for more than 60 years. Long enough for multiple generations to know no other king. To many Egyptians, Ramses may have seemed almost immortal. His family became enormous. Historical records suggest he fathered dozens of children. Royal courts expanded around him. Diplomatic marriages strengthened alliances. Among them was a remarkable peace marriage with a Hittite princess following the treaty between the two empires. And yet, beneath the grandeur, time remained undefeated. The warrior king who once raced across battlefields would eventually grow old. But Ramses had prepared for this long before his death. Because he understood something few rulers ever truly grasped. Stone could outlive flesh, and memory could outlive death itself. After more than 6 decades on the throne, Ramses II died around 1213 BC. He was believed to be over 90 years old, an extraordinary age in the ancient world. His death marked the end of one of the longest and most powerful reigns in Egyptian history. And slowly, the empire he had dominated began to weaken. Future generations struggled to maintain the same level of power. Foreign invasions, economic pressures, and political instability would eventually reshape Egypt forever. But Ramses himself refused to disappear. His body survived thousands of years. Modern studies revealed signs of arthritis, dental disease, and old age. Reminders that behind the divine image stood a real human being. Yet perhaps that is what makes Ramses so fascinating. He was both man and myth, warrior and propagandist, builder and ruler. A king who understood the power of memory better than almost anyone in history.